right. Thanks all for getting back so quickly. Apologies that you hear from me again. There's not much I can do about it. I will probably be relatively brief to give some of the other presenters more time. Mark in particular tends to blow his time frames out pretty quickly. But what I wanted to do very briefly, there's a number of presentations in this session which relate to the same area, the Carlisle Heath lands, and I wanted to give you a bit of an idea of why we were in fact investing so much research energy into the area. This is what it looks like. For those of you who aren't aware, it's beautiful heathland. There are patches that are being affected by phytophthora dieback we heard about this morning, but in reality, what's left of it is some pretty spectacular grass tree dominated dry heathlands with wet drainage systems that run through it that have wet heathland. It's a pleasure to work in. Why are we working there? There's a couple of reasons in particular. It used to be habitat for the eastern ground parrot. John Clark, a Kiro-run man, is particularly interested in the species, and therefore it's become a bit of a focus for eastern Mar. It has basically disappeared from the system, and it's one of the things that we're very interested in understanding. It has disappeared from the system. We want to know why. We have some ideas, and we'll get back to that in a moment. The other reason that we're working in the Carlisle Heathlands is it has an intact and diverse mammal assemblage. So there's species in the Carlisle Heathlands that aren't doing well elsewhere. So swan bandichinus, which we heard a little bit about earlier from Barb. There are southern brown bandicoots in reasonably good numbers, and in particular, probably the world's best long-nosed potteroo population, which is doing fabulously well. In all likelihood, a lot of this is probably associated with the grass tree skirts, which form excellent cover for the critical weight range mammals. And that's the first time in public I've said those three words together without making a complete monster of it. But they basically act as refuges for these species, the grass tree skirts. And we had been trying to design a number of studies across the Otways that looked at the association between planned burn and critical weight range mammals, that's twice, across the interaction of those two things in predation. And we simply couldn't find the species that we were targeting in good enough numbers to run experiments anywhere else in the Otways other than in the Carlisle Heath. So it became the focus of some of our work over a long period of time, well, 5 or 6, 7 years. The time eludes me, COVID's done that. The other reason we're interested in the area is it's extremely flammable. So when the vast majority of the eastern seaboard of Australia was on fire in the 2019-20 bushfire season, that always confuses people when you say 1920, we actually did have some fires that started by dry lightning strikes in the Carlisle Heath. They made a little run at the town of Jellybrand, which caused some excitement. But they're extremely flammable systems. In that particular fire in the Carlisle Heath, it was crowning at around 2 a.m, I think. The people on the ground will remember that. I was chasing roses on the Pipeline Road fire, which I did eventually find both of them. So we were starting to design a stack of experiments around critical weight range mammals. What did planned burning mean for those species? And we were able to attract some funding to stick GPS tracking collars on long-nosed potteroos. The intent of that study was to stick tracking collars on animals immediately prior to, or 3 weeks prior to, ideally, a planned burn, and then track the individuals during the fire and then after the fire. And Mark will talk to you some of the detail about this, but what this graph shows is basically the coloured polygons are the home ranges pre-fire of the potteroos, and then the orange is effectively the burnt landscape, and the green are unburnt refugia within that polygon, and the time scale shows how many days post-fire, and the red dots are when those individual animals died. So we know in this particular burnt landscape, we had 100% mortality of long-nosed potteroos within 5 days of the planned burn. So we knew that this was an extremely important population of long-nosed potteroos, and we're getting 100% mortality, obviously in one instance, and we haven't replicated it to this stage, but we needed to understand this dynamic a lot better. we could make assumptions that all of the animals were surviving the fire. Well, we knew that all the animals were surviving the fire, so we can make assumptions that this is to do with predation. Maybe the fire is simplifying the landscape's vegetation, and therefore the hunting predation by foxes and cats is becoming far more effective. And we had some pretty solid evidence that that was going on. And in order to understand that more, we put tracking collars on foxes and cats in the same landscape when these planned burns were happening. And we started to see behaviours that Mark will elucidate slightly more on in a moment, where the green dots of this animal, I believe it was called Gaston, Mark, is that correct? He names all his animals, which I think is bad scientific practice, but anyway. The green dots are where this animal was located pre-fire. And then you see after the burn scar how much time that animal is spending in the fire scar. So they are actually targeting those landscapes in order to do their predation, in all likelihood, because it becomes far more effective for them. So that's an issue. What are we going to do about it? We're going to stand around a lot in the heath and we're going to talk about it largely, but we started to develop our practice around fire, and this is a pretty, sorry Dave, it was the best photo I had, genuinely. And the bottom one is to prove that I do get out of the office once every 2 years, right? We wanted to talk about not only predator management, but also could we burn country in a way that could actually reduce the impacts on those animals? Was there a way to find a middle ground between fuel hazard reduction and improving outcomes for small mammals, which Mark is going to talk to quite a lot. From the other direction, Tamika Fairley-Lima, who will speak in this session, was doing a bit of work for the Conservation Ecology Centre at the time, looking at how, if we change the way we did fire, does that in fact change the outcomes for fuel hazard reduction? Are we still getting the benefits from managing fuel in the landscape? She was also incorporating these different burn scenarios into a population viability analysis that we did for long-nosed potoroos to show, well, if we do modify the way we burn, what does that mean for the viability of these threatened species across time? And Tamika is not going to talk exactly about that today, but those results are coming. But back to why we were there. So we don't think any of this has anything to do with the ground parrots. We think that's a completely different function. We think they were not utilising the Xanthorrhea habitat, which most of our burn program has been targeting. They were in fact in what has now become dominated by Melaleuca along the drainage lines. This species relies on low food sources, normally grains and grasses. And basically through poor practice and land management over time, or without knowing, this habitat has transitioned to basically shrub dominated, and we think its food source has disappeared. We've got a number of projects looking at that. Tamika's PhD will focus on that. Jesse Ellis is also going to be looking at how the landscape in the Carlisle Heathland has changed over time and what that vegetation has transitioned towards. I'm not going to speak towards it. It also feeds into the work of Eastern Mar and their program Remembering Our Future. Basically, we need to understand time and how vegetation has transitioned. So some of the other work that we're doing with a colleague of mine at the University of Melbourne, Michael Sean Fletcher, has been to dredge up sediment cores from the Carlisle Heathland to look at pollen and how vegetation has transitioned in time. Some of the work that Michael did in Tasmania showed that the button grass plains of the high country of Tasmania are an artefact of fire. In fact, because of their geology and rainfall, the country that is button grass plains in reality should be cool temperate rainforest and wet forest. But because of human manipulation, they're button grass plains. So we've done some work at a site called Dreite, which has also been analysed, that you can see on the right, and it shows the pollen has transitioned there away from open grassy grasslands into more dominated by invasive shrub species. Dreite's going to be talked about today, which is interesting, and a diversion, apologies. But we are going to investigate these cores, and it will show us how vegetation has changed in the Carlisle Heathland, as well as, and for the keen-eyed amongst you, you'll see the ocean there, which doesn't, in fact, back onto the Carlisle Heathland because I'm lazy and this was the quickest map I could bring up. But what this is a map that was done in the 70s, I believe, of ground parrot habitat in the Blanket Bay area versus what's mapped there now. And we want to understand what's left and how we can transition this habitat back into something similar for ground parrots. We need to understand, if we do that, what that means for the critical weight range mammals as well. So this is a balancing act between cultural, biodiversity, and in fact hazard reduction outcomes across a landscape that is relatively complex. And I think I is done, and I'm not going to give you any opportunity to ask me questions.